Hi, welcome back to another exciting episode of Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. In our program, we explore the world of archaeology, typically digging into the ground, exploring discoveries, and looking at its relationship to the reliability of the Bible. In our previous episode, we were with Dr. Kevin Anderson talking about dinosaurs in the Bible, digging into the world of paleontology and the animal kingdom, and how these great creatures relate to the scriptures. Dr. Anderson is back with us for part 2, so we can build on the previous program talking about dinosaurs and the Bible. Dr. Anderson, welcome back to the show. Good to have you here for part 2. Yes. We had so much to talk about, we couldn't do it in one show, so we're going to do it in 2 shows. And but I thought maybe we'd summarize a little bit what we did in our first part. I'm going to set the stage a little bit. So we talked about dinosaurs in the Bible. God created the dinosaurs on the 6th day, the land animals. You are doing a project called the iDino Project, and there's been soft protein tissues discovered in dinosaur fossils. This is quite extraordinary because we feel that it goes against the long-age evolutionary paradigm. So building on that, building on proteins, which are very sensitive and get destroyed easily. You talked about collagen, which if I understand it, is a little bit more stubborn, but still could not last millions of years. Let's talk about some other dinosaurs. Like, give some more examples. I know the Mary Schweitzer's dinosaur was a T-Rex, but there's been other stuff that's been discovered as well. Go ahead with that, and I'll let you run with it.
One of her dinosaurs is a T-Rex. It's a T-Rex femur they pulled out of the Hell Creek Formation in eastern Montana.
Yes.
And that was a lot of what she did, a lot of her PhD work on was that particular femur. In fact, how some of her work started was the T-Rex femur was large enough and it was down in a canyon area enough that they couldn't really carry it out, so they had to helicopter it out. But the helicopter couldn't pick up the entire femur, so they had to break it in half, which obviously, as a paleontologist, last thing you want to do is break up this beautiful fossil. But in so doing, then, they began to recognize that there's something inside this fossil that is not fossil. And so she started looking at it closer. And her background is a little bit more of a cell biology background rather than a geology, paleontology background. And so she more quickly recognized, perhaps than a trained geologist or paleontologist would have recognized, that this is biological inside this fossil. And so that's kind of what led to some of her initial work. And now, since then, she's worked with several other fossils, including the femur of a hadrosaur as well. Okay. And so there has, by this time, actually been, between the different labs around the world, there's probably been at least a couple, I don't have an exact list in front of me, but at least a couple dozen different dinosaur fossils now that have been found to have tissue from all around the world, not just a specific location in north central United States, but all around the world, fossils in China, in Poland and such. So it's not something that's just a particular condition found in one location for certain fossils. Excellent.
Excellent. Now, I read in some of your material a couple things you published last year, and I remember this very specifically. You comment on this. There's been other stuff discovered. You mentioned in the first segment, but I'm going to return to this. If I remember right, I think something called a beard worm. Is that right?
Yes.
Do I have that correct?
And that is correct.
The standard date is about 500 million years old on this beard worm. Talk about this so-called beard worm. This is very interesting.
Yeah, and a scorpion as well. Yes, these date back into the. Did you say the standard date puts them at approximately 500 million years, and yet there is certainly evidence, because we now are analytically capable of detecting very, very trace amounts of material. And so there's certainly evidence that these are containing pieces of protein still in them. And obviously that means it hasn't yet fossilized, because a true fossil would have nothing identified as biological. A true fossil is all the biological has been replaced by mineral, particularly silica and calcium carbonate.
Yes.
So if it has not been replaced yet, then that means it still retains some of its biological chemistry. And we can detect that. And in fact, that's what they're doing now. We have, by this time, we have enough technological advancement. We can detect very trace amounts of biological material. It's not fossilized yet in these 500 million year old fossils.
Yeah.
So then our argument would be, are you sure they're 500 million year old?
Yeah. And it, again, I mean, that problem, from our first part of our first episode, we talked about, the dinosaurs from 65 to 200 and some odd million years old, and they found this protein material and other things. Now you got this worm that's allegedly 500 million years old.
Yes.
And it's got some organic material in it. I mean, that's got to be looked at. I mean, that kind of screams, out at you. Shorter time frame.
It's not just any organic material. It's organic material associated with biological organisms.
Yeah,
that's the key. This is not just something that just you find organic material here or there. Anyway, this is organic material that comes from animals, that comes from life.
Yes.
And so this is not a result of contamination. This is from what was there initially
in the animal. Now, we got about a minute in this first segment. I want to introduce what the specific the Triceratops horn that you guys have worked with. Do an intro for that, a little bit, about a minute, and then we'll build on that in the next segment. Go.
In 2012, the Creation Research Society sent a team of us to, again, an area in the Hell Creek Formation in eastern Montana, and we dug up a almost 4-foot long Triceratops horn. And this was, as far as our guides knew, this was the longest Triceratops horn that had ever been found in the eastern part of Montana, perhaps in all of Montana. And of course, that we were going to take and break it up was just, very disturbing to them, because this would have made a beautiful museum piece. But the price of science, we wanted it to examine. And so Mark Armitage at that time was our microscopist, and he gave it a very thorough microscopic examination and found some very fascinating stuff.
Cool. Well, we're gonna tell the audience more about that, and we're also going to tell them a little bit about. You and I didn't mention this before together, but I remember the Triceratops horn was featured in the movie Is Genesis History, which you were in, and we'll give people information about that. Now, folks, don't go away, because Dr. Anderson is still getting into it here. We're going to talk about this Triceratops, these great 3-horned creatures that you see in books and in movies that children love. Well, we're going to tell you more exciting things about this horn that's been discovered, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. We're digging into the world of dinosaurs, not archaeology today. But the important part of this is that we're relating it to the Bible. And this might seem strange to the viewer, those of you watching. Dinosaurs and the Bible, how do they relate to each other? Doesn't dinosaurs prove that the biblical account of creation is inaccurate and the account of the flood? Well, we're exploring that question today with Dr. Kevin Anderson, and we propose that actually the evidence vindicates the time frame given in the Bible and the early chapters of the book of Genesis. Dr. Anderson, we were discussing a discovery that you and your organization made of a Triceratops horn, 4 feet long. I'd like you to build on that and share with the audience some more about that particular discovery.
Yes, we discovered a Triceratops horn in eastern Montana. This horn was almost 4 foot long. It was a monster horn.
Yes.
And this clearly was not all of it. In other words, some of it was exposed out the end of the cliff, which is how we knew it was there to begin with. So it was obviously even longer than that. Now, what's fascinating about this horn is that when it was microscopically examined, there was nice pieces of stretchable material, and some video of that is in that movie, Is Genesis History. If you've seen that movie, that's some of the stretchable material that was found in this horn. And also beautiful pictures of intact cells that are called osteocytes. Osteocytes are bone cells.
Okay.
And they're very specific cells. This is not a contaminating skin cell, because skin cells look entirely different. Osteocytes have their own unique structure.
Okay.
And Mary Schweitzer and her team have also found osteocytes in her fossils as well. And so these cells are still intact. They haven't decomposed. They haven't deteriorated. And so it's beautiful preservation of these cells along with this nice stretchable tissue. And so what we're seeing in this horn is wonderful examples of all the preservation that occurred in supposedly a horn that should be about 68 million years of age.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is we found this horn about a foot down from the surface. Now, what makes that interesting is if you're buried real deep, then you could argue that, well, the fossil is protected from all the thermal variation from the winter, weather changes and the rain and such, but only a foot down. It's going to be exposed to the very, very cold of the Montana winter, the very, very hot of the Montana summer. You're also going to have penetrating rainwater. In fact, when we pulled the horn up, it was damp underneath. And in fact, I turned to Mark Armitage and said, well, there's no way we're going to find anything in this because it's wet, it's muddy. There's not going to be. So even from a creationist perspective, I didn't expect to find anything. And then lo and behold, there was all kinds of tissue in there. So what we're looking at is anything but pristine preservation. And there's no way that you can logically, in everything we know about biochemistry, you can logically argue that this horn is older than just a few thousand years. And even then, it's a bit surprising there was tissue, but certainly you can't say that this horn is millions and millions of years old and still have this kind of tissue.
A foot.
It just was exposed. Yeah, a foot. It was just exposed
from the surface.
Too much. Yes, a foot from the surface.
Yeah.
So
it had everything going against it in terms of preservation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Water, mud, infiltration of potential plant material, certainly temperature fluctuations. Any biochemist can tell you the fastest way to destroy proteins and the fastest way to destroy tissue is to put it through temperature fluctuations. Hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold.
Yeah.
That will destroy biological material faster than anything. And that's what this horn would have been exposed to, was hot, cold, rainwater, penetrating, plant material, microbes. So it was exposed to everything that would tell us that there's no way that this tissue would survive more than just a few thousand years.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to encourage our viewers to watch the movie Is Genesis History. You can see Dr. Anderson with the Triceratops horn in that movie, and we'll give that information out too. So now I'm going to change directions quickly on you here. I'm going to ask you a question that everybody has in mind out there that's watched Jurassic Park, and that is, can you clone a dinosaur, Dr. Anderson?
Well, the short answer is no. Despite what the Hollywood says, first off, to clone any animal, you have to have its entire set of chromosomes. And obviously, we don't have any chromosomes for the dinosaur.
Yes.
So even if you've had a little bit, you can't clone anything with just a little bit. You got to have it all.
Yes.
But what is fascinating is there's been some very tantalizing evidence that there is still within some of the cells in the dinosaur fossils pieces of DNA. And of course, DNA is even more DNA is even more sensitive. DNA decays even faster than proteins decay. So it's hard enough to explain the proteins. Try to explain the DNA. And so that's going to become even a greater challenge to evolutionists. And so I think if an evolutionist actually does find in their laboratory definitive evidence of DNA, they're going to be in quite a dilemma, because as a scientist, they'll want to publish it, but as evolutionists, they'll know this is going to be very, very damaging to the evolutionary time frame.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking of I can't remember the psalm, but it says, truth springs from the earth. God's word, of course, and here we have evidence. Every time we dig in the ground, archaeology, paleontology, dinosaurs, we find evidence that vindicates the biblical accounts. Got about 45 seconds left, Dr. Anderson. I'd like you to sum up the importance of all this for the church. And I know that 45 seconds is kind of tough, but go for it and tell people in the church why this is so important.
Well, it's important because when you start trying to impose these long ages onto Genesis, science is telling us the earth is billions of years old, that all these fossils are millions of years old. What you're doing is you're distorting the text and you're making the text say something it doesn't say. And then where does it stop? We've had people actually claim, well, history in the Bible doesn't start until, Genesis 11, Genesis 12, whatever. Well, how do you know?
Yes.
And how do you know that it starts there? Why does it start there? Maybe it doesn't start until Exodus. Maybe it doesn't start until later. The very type of criticisms that you guys get for the Tower of Babel, for the Exodus and such, the same mentality is implied then to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. See, it's been disproven to actually be historical. Therefore, the history in the Bible is flawed. Therefore, the Bible itself is flawed. And we see then the effects of that in the American church and the church worldwide today. Look at Europe. Europe gave up on the authenticity of the Bible decades ago.
Yes.
And when you give up on the authenticity of the Bible, then what do you have? What you have is you have paganism.
Yeah. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back for our last segment.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. In our last segment, we were talking with Dr. Kevin Anderson about the importance of dinosaurs, research that he's doing with his organization, the Creation Research Society, talking about particularly a Triceratops bone that has protein material that's been found in it, showing that these animals could not have been buried millions of years ago, but only recently. We've always also talked about how this is important to the church, the reliability of the scriptures. But what we want to do in our last segment here is just sort of wrap up our discussion of these two parts. The first question, Dr. Anderson, will go to is thinking about the evolutionist community, okay? We're excited, you and I are beyond excited, and hopefully our audience, about, again, the evidence vindicates the Bible's presentation of history, particularly the early chapters of Genesis. But do the evolutionists accept some of this, not the time frame, because I know what you're going to say about that, but that this evidence is real, and what are you seeing as far as how they're dealing with it?
Because the presence of tissue, presence of biological material, particularly protein fragments, is completely inconsistent with their time frame, with the dates they've placed on these fossils, then yes, initially there was great hesitation on the evolutionist community. In fact, that was one of the reasons that Dr. Schweitzer was so hesitant to initially publish the work, because she knew there'd be a lot of pushback. And of course there was. Now, the advantage of that was it required people to do even more careful work.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that the evolutionist community was probably able to dismiss reports that date back to the 60s and 70s and 80s is because technologically you could argue that we just simply couldn't say for certain that it might have been contamination. It might have been something else. There was just too much uncertainty, and they could play into that and say, well, because we can't really believe that this tissue would actually be in these fossils then, or that these proteins would actually be in these fossils, it must be something else. But because the 21st century has seen such technological advancements, see, that argument is very quickly disappearing. My colleague on the iDino project, one of my colleagues on the iDino project is Brian Thomas at the Institute of Creation Research, not to be confused with the Creation Research Society.
Yes.
Okay. He has been able to do some work where he has detected collagen still in the bone. It's not a matter of extracting. It's not a matter of detecting by the typical processes that would have been done back in the 80s and 90s and even the early part of the 21st century, but actually take the fossil, put it in the analysis, and actually say right there is collagen. And so you can't call that any kind of misdetection by some kind of lab contamination. And you can't call it lab contamination when you break open the fossil and it's right there.
Yeah.
See, so those arguments are quickly disappearing. Now, ironically, some of the ones still pushing back the hardest, still not fully ready to accept that this is actual, authentic dinosaur biological material that survived all this time, are the biochemists, because the biochemists know better. They know proteins cannot survive that long. So they're in quite a conundrum, especially the biochemists that work with older material. There's a group of them, for example, in Europe, that's their specialty, is working with archaeological samples, for example, and using the decay of the biological material as part of a dating process for the archaeological, for the bone that's been found in the pyramid or in the cave or whatever. And so they have a lot of data that they point to that says we know these proteins can't survive for millions of years. And that data is very good data. And they stand by it. And so they're the ones pushing back the hardest, saying it cannot be.
Yeah.
Now, the irony is, see, they're in that typical conundrum. They're not going to abandon the evolutionary paradigm, which is what the data tells them they should do. They're going to stick to it. They're just going to reject the data. They're going to reject that this can't be actual dinosaur tissue. So, in fact, early in all of this, Dr. Schweitzer talks of a time when she was trying to publish where one of her reviewers is saying that I can't believe this. And she wrote back and she said, well, what evidence would you believe? And says, there's no evidence that you could present that make me believe this. In other words, the paradigm reigns.
Wow. Yeah.
So you cannot say these are younger than millions of years, no matter what the data is.
Yeah. And it does, we talked about it earlier, and I want to emphasize it again for our audience because we talk about it on this program all the time. There's evidence. We talk about archaeology. You're talking about, exploring, looking at dinosaurs.
Paleontology. Yes.
Paleontology, right? Different sciences, but the data has to fit in a paradigm. And
correct.
Worldviews influence the way that people look at things and how they interpret them, and often influence how data is rejected or explained away and all that kind of thing.
I see that in the archaeology world all the time.
Yes.
Their worldview determines that this can't be what it appears to be because that doesn't fit my worldview.
Yeah, that's
not
right.
Scientific, but very human.
Yeah, well, very human, and it shows the spiritual need that is in the scientific community and every community of human beings, that there's a spiritual need to see the world as God has given it and represented it in his revelation. Dr. Anderson, you got about a minute left. If you could wrap up, I know this has been an enormous subject, but I hope we've done a good job for our folks watching to understand it. If you could just take about a minute and wrap it up, what you think is most important.
The authenticity of the Bible would mean then that the biblical history is the true history of this earth, not the pagan history we're taught in our textbooks and our science classes.
Yes.
Has nothing to do with biblical history, has nothing to do with God's history of the earth. Okay. Scientifically, we're saying here is evidence that supports God's history of the earth. These dinosaur fossils and other fossils are not millions of years old. They're going to be just a few thousands of years old, as the Bible would tell us.
Yes.
They almost certainly were preserved by being buried in the flood.
In the flood, right.
And that would account also for the rapid burial that would give you tissue preservation. Now, you've got to have precise types of rapid burial. Yeah, exactly. A flood would do that. Other models, they struggle with that some. How did these dinosaur fossils get buried correctly that they would actually preserve for any length of time?
Yeah, that's right.
So while we see scientifically time and time and time again, just as you guys talk about with your archaeology, we would talk about with the paleontology, this supports the biblical history, not the pagan history that we're being taught and that too many Christians are paying attention to. Get back to the biblical history. That's God's history. When you change history, you change everything.
Yes.
And that's the point that the Is Genesis History movie made. When you start trying to change the biblical history, you change the entire dynamic of the Bible. Because everything then starts falling apart.
That's a great way to end the program. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining us. And friend, thank you for joining us today. We talked about exciting subject of dinosaurs and the Bible.